A common mistake of beginning orchestral composers is having all or most instruments playing all or most of the time. There are two problems with this. First, when too much is going on at the same time, the listener will often overlook or miss parts of the music. Second, each section of the orchestra can only be tolerated by the listener for a certain period of time before aural fatigue sets in. It will be useful to remember the following. The greater the intensity of the sound, the quicker it will wear on the ear. If cymbal crashes, for example, were played for 30 minutes straight, the sound would become unbearable because the sound of a cymbal crash is very intense. If, on the other hand, a violin were to be played for 30 minutes straight, we wouldn't mind at all because its sound is more mild. In the orchestra, each section has a certain degree of intensity. The order of the sections from most intense to least intense is percussion, brass, woodwinds, then strings. The intensity of a section has a direct correlation to the percentage of time that a section typically plays during a piece. So according to this list, the percussion section should play for the least amount of time since it is the most intense, and the string section for the greatest amount of time since it is the least intense. You can see that this is generally the case when we analyze the orchestral scores of the great composers. Let's look at a famous symphony to get a sense of how frequently each section of the orchestra plays. In the following charts, each movement of Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6 was analyzed measure by measure to determine the percentage of time each section played. Although these numbers will be slightly different for every piece, composer, and time period, this will give you a general idea of how often each section plays. Pause the video to study the graphs. Here are the percentages for all four movements combined. As you can see, the more intense a section is, the less frequently it plays. Does this mean that when you write a piece of music, you need to keep track of how many measures each section is playing? Of course not. When Tchaikovsky wrote this symphony, he didn't count up the number of measures the brass were playing to determine whether he had too much or too little brass. He just instinctively knew what a good amount of brass would be. As a beginning composer for orchestra, simply keep these percentages in mind as a guideline, and try and be aware of how often you are using each section. You may have noticed that the strings play for almost 100% of the time. In addition to their mild sound, there are a number of other reasons for this. String players do not need to breathe, like woodwind or brass players, and can therefore play for longer periods of time. Strings are very agile and capable of more playing techniques than any other instrument. They have an extremely large range, both individually and as a group. There are almost no problems with blending or balance. Dynamics are not affected by register like woodwinds and brass are. And now we turn to the frequency of tutti. How often should the entire orchestra play together? Tutti does not necessarily mean that every single instrument is playing. Tutti also commonly refers to instances where a majority of the orchestra is playing. In the same symphony, we find the following percentages of tutti passages. If you compare this graph with the previous graphs, you will see that the percentage of time that a majority of the orchestra plays together is much less than the percentage of time the string, woodwind, or brass sections play. Tutti are generally used in climaxes and at other key moments in a piece. If the majority of the orchestra is playing the majority of the time, then there is absolutely no possibility for climaxes or any contrast, and the audience will quickly experience aural fatigue.